Throughout Studio 2, the ALA cohort have been investigating and implementing a variety of emerging technologies as part of their project proposals. Now, I have been working on the procedural generation aspect of this particular project proposal, specifically to do with the maze, so let's dive into it. Procedural generation is the method of using a script or an algorithm to create data, as opposed to producing that data manually. Typically, especially in video games, this is used to automatically create large amounts of game content, where in Studio 1 I researched live animation and photogrammetry. Whilst live animation and photogrammetry involve the capturing of data, procedural generation involves the production of data that is then used to produce a solid mesh. So let's discuss the strengths and the weaknesses of procedural generation in regards to the in-between. The major strength of procedural generation is that it keeps the maze different with each new session of play. This helps solve two problems. The first problem is that players who have played multiple times will still find the same amount of difficulty when solving the maze. The second strength is that gameplay will never become stale due to not just the maze changing, but also the placement of items required to complete the game. However, because procedural generation is used, it is a much wilder experience to produce the maze compared to just using a specific maze asset. In a Gama Sutra article, Ichiro Lambert, founder of the Deijoban game studio, wrote, "Things that were completely unplayable popped up, but so did things that ended up being fun in ways we didn't expect." Lambert also wrote, "If you want to add a few trees around the entrance to a cave, it's usually easier just to plop a few down by hand and nudge them around than to script that." This lines up with my experience of producing a procedural maze, as part of the design is to include special rooms such as a starting room and a few additional areas for players to investigate. Ultimately, this was easier to achieve by manually editing another procedural generated maze image in something like Photoshop before converting the image into geometry. So let's have a look at how procedural generation influences the quality, the time, and the cost of the project. In terms of quality, a procedural maze gives the game something that was discussed earlier. Experienced players after multiple sessions will still find the game fresh and different. Furthermore, because the maze generation is automated, people working on the project can better spend their efforts producing better quality assets and better quality textures that can be placed throughout the maze, as well as fine-tuning the mechanics and other emerging tech that is also featured in the game. Now, when it comes to time spent, the time saved will tie directly with the cost savings as well, as an algorithm and generated dataset are producing the maze mesh. That saves a lot of time when it comes to designing the maze and modeling the maze as a set. However, a lot of time needs to be spent determining how to script the maze designing process, as well as writing out the algorithms necessary to generate the maze. Now, I believe procedural generation in our project will ultimately be a net benefit once that part of the process is complete. We will not need to worry about base maze creation ever again outside of bug fixes. Additional changes to the look and design of the maze may also be handled with additional scripts as well. And finally, let's have a look at how this project and the technology used is relevant to the future of the industry. Procedural generation is already being used in a variety of different ways, with popular games such as Path of Exile, No Man's Sky, Minecraft, and the Diablo franchise using procedural generation to create worlds and maps, as well as Warframe that uses a tile set in order to procedurally generate its missions, and the Borderlands, Path of Exile, and Diablo series use procedural generation to create items and weapons with random statistics. It is also a good sign that talks are given at the GDC, also known as the Games Developer Conference, on how Path of Exile as a procedural game is a game designed to be played forever. In this speech, Chris Wilson, Managing Director of Grinding Gear Games, talks about procedural generation and how it helped with the 13-week development cycle.
Procedural level generation is critical because your leagues, or whatever is appropriate for your game, need new content for players to actually play through. And that means making new areas, because you've got to go to new places. But the traditional way of making levels in games can be slow and involves placing a bunch of things around and involving artists and taking time.
Chris Wilson also showed how the 13-week development cycle was a key part of growing the game's play hours, something that had been decreasing during the first 3 years of Path of Exile's existence. When developers and publishers hear these results, I have no doubt they will be interested in emulating them with this technology. In the end, I have found the learning and development of procedural generation to be quite fun and exciting. So when Studio 3 rolls on, I am looking forward to further developing this if we end up choosing a game like The In-Between or Labyrinth. Now, whether or not we choose to use a ground-up method such as the one that I have been using for procedural generation proof of concept via the Ray Wenderlich tutorial, or we use something like wave function collapse, we'll just have to see. So until then, thanks for watching.